Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Soldera Markets. Today we're joined by Mary Polovtseva. She is an expert on guarantees of origin and a renewable policy analyst with Veyt. Veyt are a firm who focus on providing insights into environmental commodities, but also low carbon markets, including renewable power, fuels, and carbon. They keep an eye on market trends and policy developments, which is why Mary is super informed about guarantees of origin. This episode is jam-packed with information, and we really hope you guys enjoy.
Thank you, Mary. And to give you a quick introduction about me, I'm Stenver, founder and CEO of Soldera. We help to automate guarantees of origin, compliance management, and sales for renewable energy producers. Yeah, we've been using Veyt for almost a half year now. It's been very, very useful for us. It helped us understand where the market is at daily, give us an idea of the trends and how it's going to move. So we really appreciate all the webinars you guys have been doing and everything like that. And I can definitely recommend to all the listeners out there.
Thank you. That's good to hear.
I'm immediately fascinated, obviously, given the fact that guarantees of origin are a market that are pretty much entirely dependent on, policy changes. Policy analyst is itself a separate role from sort of the analyst who will look at price movements. So can you explain why those two things are separated just off the bat?
I would start by saying that I'm looking mostly on the European level regulatory developments. And as you've seen recently, there's a lot coming out of Brussels, and all these policies and regulations are now having an increasing impact on the European guarantees of origin market. So if you open any sustainability related document, you will see that there are some provisions that are really important for the market. And that's the reason why you need to have a person sitting down and digging into those documents to read them, to understand them, and really translate what's going to happen to the market as a result of those changes. And if we're talking about a separate position of a market analyst, they mostly follow what's happening in the auctions. They follow what's happening with data prices, where the movements are going. So I would say this is the primary difference between these two roles.
So, Mary, I think the policy is a very hot topic right now, guarantees of origin. We've all seen how the market prices in guarantees of origin, they sort of had their massive peak. They went to like 8 to 10 euros a few years ago, only actually 2 summers ago, right? It wasn't even that long ago. And then suddenly they just crashed because we had a lot of rain in Norway. The reservoirs were full. And in general, there's been a lot of renewable. And then everybody was betting on, of course, that the corporate transparency reporting, the CSRD, comes out. This will drive a lot of demand towards guarantees of origin. Lately, of course, we've had pretty intense geopolitical situation in the world.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what's your gut feeling on where do you see this going? Do you already hear voices in Brussels about let's pull back some of the green commitments in order to go more into defense, or how do you see this playing out? I think that's honestly one of the top questions on the top of everybody's mind in this sector.
Yeah, so I think you touched on a good amount of subjects here, Stenberg, because definitely what we're seeing is that what's happening on the geopolitical scene also has ripple effects for Europe. And as you've correctly noted, now there's a different subject that entered the scene. If before we only spoke of energy transition and decarbonization, I think now defense as a topic on its own is becoming increasingly important. And this is where the subjects of decarbonization and energy transition will have to fight for their place to stay competing with defense. But I don't think personally energy transition is going anywhere. The Commission very clearly confirmed that they want to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2040, and they will be filing a separate proposal in order to achieve that. So I think there's a very clear signal emanating from the Commission that they're not abandoning their idea, the project that they've been working on for the past 5 years, the European Green Deal. Yeah, because you touched on so many things here, so I just wanted to set the scene with that, and then just maybe move on to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is CSRD, that you have mentioned. And a lot of people in the market really place their bets on that because it really carried the promise of bringing additional guarantees of origin demand onto the market by virtue of affecting 50,000 companies in the union. So that was the scope of that directive, right? And just to give you more details as to why it is important to the market. So if you look at the requirements of the CSRD, the companies need to report according to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And if you look at those standards, you will see that when disclosing your energy consumption and mix, companies need to use guarantees of origin or PPAs. That is very clearly stated in the text. And if you look at Scope 2 greenhouse gas emission reporting, the Commission embraced dual reporting, which is when we use market-based and location-based method to report Scope 2 emissions. And I guess for listeners who don't know what the difference between the two is, the location-based method is basically when you take emissions from your national grid. And market-based is when you do active carbon intensity management. So you choose to use geos or PPAs or a combination of these two instruments. But you can also use residual mix, which does not require any investments on your end. And third component of CSRD is that companies need to set Scope 2 reduction targets, and they can do that according to the market-based or location-based method. So in a nutshell, this is the reason why it's so important for the market.
Really appreciate the thorough answer, and I'll give a quick comment about the European position on the renewable transition as well before we can get to the more technical aspects you mentioned, which I think are very interesting on their own. You know, if we think about it, the renewable energy transition is a lot about defense as well. It's about independence, right? Especially now that we see that on both sides of the globe, there's a clear signal that you need to get sovereign. Europe doesn't have massive amounts of gas and other reserves they can just tap into. I mean, we have Norway, but we import a lot. So obviously we need to make sure we have our energy security. The renewable transition, I think, plays a vital role actually in defense and energy security, which are often actually the same thing, let's be honest. So
I'm interested specifically in policy just because it feels like, because the landscape of policy is so broad, I'm understanding that there are initiatives now to sort of consolidate a lot of it together, whether that's via Omnibus or in other methods. So maybe it'd be good to see how this landscape's coming together, just for listeners who might be struggling to kind of see where everything is at right now, because there's so many different elements.
Sure. So I should probably start by saying that there are many different legislations that are contributing to increasing geo demand on the market, but one of the most important ones is the Corporate Sustainability Framework that we have in the EU. That consists of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Due Diligence Directive, and the EU Taxonomy. And Ollie, you've mentioned the simplification of these rules, and you're absolutely correct. The Commission recently unveiled its Omnibus package, or simplification package, as it is also called. Some would say that the Commission is practically killing its darlings because it is drastically reducing the scope of the companies that would be affected. So I've mentioned previously, if before 50,000 companies would be reporting under CSRD, now only 10,000 companies would do that. So that's an 80% reduction, and that's pretty big.
what's the chances of that going through right now? Any indications?
Yeah, so really important to keep in mind that it's just a proposal at this stage, and the proposal has to go through the ordinary legislative procedure where both the Council and the Parliament need to give their views on the directive. So we'll see what's going to happen, because there's opposition from the centre as well as from the leftist factions of the Parliament, whereas the right-wing parties are, I would say, are very happy about the proposal, because the European People Party, the political family where Ursula von der Leyen stems from, actually deposited a letter to the Commission asking them to simplify the sustainability reporting rules. So that's what they got.
The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Standard is a large framework, right? The GEOs is only a small part of it, right? If there's a lot of pushback on this reporting because it's administratively burdensome and creates a lot of compliance issues, while at the same time, guarantees of origin, for example, are pretty simple to manage for most people. And, it's just public database and information that reports it. Do you see that are geos part of like a big part of the Omnibus pushback, or is there something else, or what is actually the subject of discussion over here, or that companies want to push back on?
So I think there are two things to talk about here. What the Omnibus actually purports to do, and we know of that, which is to basically narrow the scope. So we have other large companies that need to start reporting in 2026 for the financial year 2025, plus listed SMEs, which need to start reporting between 2027 to 2029. They would be out of scope. So they would be out of the picture. So then we know that these entities probably will not be seeking to buy geos if the proposal comes through and gets adopted as is. On the other hand, when you speak specifically to geos, it's also important to mention that as part of the Omnibus package, it says that the Commission is planning to revise the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which carve out a specific role for geos. And the Commission was not very straightforward as to what it's going to do, because all it said was that we're going to try to cut down the amount of data points that companies need to report and to make it so that there's less qualitative reporting and more quantitative reporting. In my personal opinion, that does not concern geos, because if you look at the template that the Commission provided, it is quantitative. You just need to plug in the numbers and that's it. I don't think that geos will be affected. But at the same time, softening the blow, the Commission said that it will file a separate proposal to try and develop a voluntary sustainability reporting standards for companies that would be excluded from the scope of CSRD.
I think that being an entrepreneur myself makes a lot of sense, because like these qualitative reporting data points you mentioned, like geos, for example, which are, it's simply how much power you use, how much of that is renewable. It's simple math. Like, it's very easy to measure that, very easy to comply with them, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. Like in most companies, like you don't need a special person or anybody to work on that. Trouble does come in the qualitative reporting, where you usually need to hire a bunch of consultants to tell you what does even all of that mean, right? To me, from this very small amount of information, does sound like would actually remove majority of that burden that companies want to push back on.
Definitely. And I also think another good signal that we have is that we have a bunch of CSRD compliant reports that are now becoming publicly available. And I have reviewed close to 100 of them, so my eyes were bleeding. But it allowed me to draw some useful insights. So for instance, if before companies, when they used to do voluntary sustainability reporting, such as to CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project, they could cherry pick whether to report their location-based or market-based Scope 2 emissions. And now the Commission put a stop to this by saying you absolutely need to use dual reporting. All 100 reports that I have reviewed, they've actually heeded to that instruction. They all report both market-based and location-based emissions, which I think is beautiful, and it really drives change on the market and makes it more transparent.
That's good to hear. And I guess then the big question is, what about Norway?
Yeah, I wouldn't just point fingers at Norway, because surprisingly, I saw several German reports where they're using location-based Scope 2 emissions, and they specifically advertise them. So yeah, I think Norway is another subject for sure. There's been a lot of resistance to guarantees of origin, so much so that there were discussions of pulling out of the geosystem entirely. Last year, around summer 2024, the government finally shifted gears and said, okay, we're not going to do this because it brings a lot of money into our budget. And in times and days like these, every single penny counts. But instead, they're looking to introduce changes to the geosystem itself. And we'll find out the details later this year.
That's good to hear, because we often, like when I go and speak with people who are not in the market, then that is a topic that does come up a lot. And I guess next topic I'd love to hear your opinion on is the fact that you can use like solar in the winter. Where do you see the policy moving in terms of like the granularity of the geos and Because I know what a lot of market participants that are existing incumbents think. They prefer not to have change, right? They prefer the status quo for very obvious reasons, because it's simple. You can easily run your business on it. It kind of works. But, ultimately, as with everything, you start with Nokia, but eventually you want to build an iPhone. So how do you see this moving right now on the market, and what's your thoughts on that?
So far, there's only one regulation on the market that pushes towards greater granularity, and we are talking about from monthly temporarily matching to hourly after 2030, and that regulation is the RFNBO Delegated Act, which governs renewable hydrogen production. So this is the only regulation of the market that I can directly point a finger at and say, this is the only driving force behind granularity. But I have not seen any other regulations that are encouraging this. In the Renewable Energy Directive, there's a clear provision to be able to issue sub-megawatt hour geos, so encouraging smaller sized geos, if you will. But I think increasingly it will be member states themselves driving this policy change and driving granular geos, essentially. So, for instance, we have temporal matching requirements in France on monthly level. In Switzerland, it's going to be on quarterly level from 2027. And now in Ireland, a little bit told me they're also discussing granular geos for large electricity users. And I will be releasing an analysis soon on that.
And is that only for because, right now, essentially monthly that you can use over the year? And then is the only other type of discussion the hourly based granularity, or is there something between? Because a lot of people I've noticed, especially traders and brokers, have discussed that actually all we need is just quarterly or half a year geos, or just yearly cutoffs. So you can't use last year for the existing year. And, you can sort of granularly roll out more granularity instead of jumping from, well, let's be honest, pretty crude solution to extremely tight solution. And rather let industry adapt new reality. Do you see on the policy side any of this discussion as well?
I haven't seen any movements, not that I'm aware of, but having said that, there will be an upcoming revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. Even though we have just revised it, there will be another revision because the Commission is setting a new greenhouse gas reduction target. So that will necessarily trigger talks about, okay, what renewable share do we need to have in our electricity mix? And that will cascade into affecting Article 19, which governs the guarantees of origin market. So this is policy-wise, but I would say in the voluntary space, there's much more talk about hourly geos. And in particular, if we talk about the greenhouse gas protocol, which is currently being revised, this is one of the options that's being discussed, and we'll see whether it gets implemented. Personally, I don't think so, because it depends on the readiness of the different registries, and I don't think that most are ready to transition to greater granularity.
But then we have these industry leading players like Google, for example, who I think are already actively using hourly granularity, if I'm not mistaken. Have you heard anything about what they have been said on the policy front, or how things are moving?
I think it's important to keep in mind that Google and the likes of them in the IT space, they're heavily invested in that because they are also the developers of TEECs, I think it's Timed Energy Attribute Certificates. That's the correct way the abbreviation works. So they were the pioneers behind this concept, and they want to sell it to the wider public. So obviously they're pushing the Commission into high granularity, but I don't know how that's going to work out. But there are definitely pilots around Europe that are working.
So just moving away from granularity, I'm interested, obviously, you're covering so many different policy types and you're having to spot patterns and signals across all of them. To what extent do you think is pricing really factored into a lot of the decision making at a level like the European Union? Obviously, it's a tool designed to incentivize, increase production capacity in the continent. But do you think boosting or preserving, that incentive is actually really factored into decision making?
I think it is increasingly being factored in because the Commission actually ordered a report on the functioning of the geo market by the end of 2025, if I remember correctly. So that will give them an insight on what's happening on the guarantees of origin market. And I think that will aid in their decision making too.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this. Is this the open kind of call for input about the geo market?
I think it could be part of that, yes, because there's been a recently launched survey by DGNR on the functioning of the guarantees of origin market. So I think they're collecting the public view on the functioning of the market, and then they will also be carrying out studies on their own to then present results to the Commission.
Interesting.
One of the things I've noticed is that, well, we basically have 2 layers of implementation of the geo market. We have the directives, the RED, 2 and 3 and so on, and plus everything you keep up to date with. And then we have the local laws. And there seems to be actually like quite a long lag between implementation of every single thing that like the new versions of directives have gone out. Just to give an example, so in Soldera, we started in Estonia. The founding of Estonia, Soldera, is actually quite interesting. I mean, we had been in environmental assets markets for 10 years. And then we wanted to move away from carbon credits, just decided to move away, and we analyzed through every environmental asset. And we really like geos because they seemed highly regulated, liquid, legit, no greenwashing issues. Like it ticked all the boxes for us. So then what we did is we called a few of our friends who have solar panels on the fields or on the roofs. We took a wine bottle. We went to visit them. We helped them to fill out all the paperwork. Many of them had never done any geos. We noticed 30% had never earned any income in geos. So if you look at the AIB residual mix reports, 30% of renewable energy is just uncounted and residual energy. So that was like our catalyst. And it was really cool. We basically started with the idea, how can we help the small to medium sized producers get on board? And we built a solution for them. We bought our French geos, we sold them, and then we started scaling there and wrote our software. And then what we noticed, very interestingly, is that even though the RED III directive says that the small players need to have easier onboarding as options, in Estonia, like it's super simple for them. And it is easier than for big players as well. But when you go to like Latvia, then they need to pay like 500 to 1,000 euros audit cost. We started lobbying that, and now they're in the process of changing that, but it's taken like a year of work. In Lithuania, there's a thing called prosumer scheme, like micro owners can't basically get any geos. In Sweden, there's 400 euro or something account fee, or I don't remember the exact sum. Maybe it was, I think it was less, but basically, again, it sort of pushes out all the small players. In Finland, they need to buy a special device to their home. Again, it pushes them out, which costs like 100 plus euros. And how do you see, like, because in every country we go to, we do see some regulatory differences as well. Not huge ones, but slight differences. And then obviously there are countries that are adopting this a lot faster, but then some are, they haven't been able to keep up with the RED III directive, and now we maybe already have a new directive coming out soon. So how do you see this going?
Yeah, I think definitely transposition and implementation on national level is a big problem because in this sense, the European Union is fragmented and it's largely up to the member states themselves how fast they will move these processes along. So I think it's a very valid problem that you've pointed out, and it just goes to show that the market is fragmented. Even though it's one single geo market, at the same time it is fragmented because you have different national rules that are currently applied. There could be changes to them as well.
Something else I saw pop up is the idea, well, I think it might have been in response to a lot of the heat that the EU is feeling about being competitive on a global stage, is the competitiveness compass. I wonder how that relates to the geo markets. Obviously, it adopts a very sort of market-centric and ideologically pro-market approach to competitiveness. Do you see that having a relationship to the geo markets and EACs or not?
Yeah, so competitiveness compass is a communication that was specifically addressed to the council and the parliament to, in a way, inform them of the work that's coming in the next 5 years. And it had certain elements in it that are relevant to the guarantees of origin market. and they in turn fed into the clean industrial deal that was presented this week or last week, if I remember correctly. One of the measures that was announced is to introduce decarbonized public procurement, which is really interesting because they're trying to tie made in Europe requirements to carbon management as well. So this is where we could see GOs play a greater role, and considering that public tenders consider 40% of European GDP, I would say that's a pretty big number. So that could definitely move the geo market. We just need to wait for the legislative proposal from the Commission to get in on the details of what that would entail.
Obviously, you hear a lot about it, but it's not something I've ever really dug into at a deep level. So it'd be great if you could touch on that and how you think it has a relationship to geos.
Yeah, definitely. There are lots of things happening, so I can imagine it's difficult to keep track of everything. Yeah, so the Clean Industrial Deal is a strategy that replaces the European Green Deal that we've had before. And it was presented alongside with the Omnibus package that we've discussed previously. And it basically sets out the European Commission's vision for the European development for the next 5 years, but also beyond that as well. It proposes certain measures that are meant to perform CPR on the European economy, if you will, because now the European Commission, it wants to marry decarbonization and competitiveness so that we in Europe have a decarbonized market. So that's one way of looking at the Clean Industrial Deal. And then within it, it has many different suggestions how to lower the energy prices, how to kickstart the European economy, and how to ensure that we have continuous renewables expansion in the Union.
Speaking of that, like continuous renewables expansion, guarantees of origin at their philosophical level are basically for two things, right? It's tracking where the energy came from, which is very important for anybody that wants to buy renewable energy. And it's the additionality, like to incentivize building more renewables power plants. So a lot to make sure that we do continue developing new plants and give a premium for the renewable energy. So then a natural question to follow up is like, how much impact has the renewable energy sector gotten from guarantees of origin? How many investments has it driven? I just saw a very Landesvirkjun post from Iceland. They said that they earned 7% of their operational income came from guarantees of origin. That's amazing. That's incredibly surprising for me, to be honest. Like, it's way above what I expected anybody to earn. And like, I can absolutely see how this would incentivize them to build more. And because, that's a significant increase in revenue, not to mention in profitability. It's a massive increase because, these are somewhat low margin businesses. I believe in policy talks, has to be one of the key points in discussions. What have you noticed in the policies, and how much is that topic of discussion actually?
I think I would start by saying, to just have a little precision in here, that legally speaking, geos have just one clearly defined role, which is energy tracking. Anything beyond that, so for instance, additional revenues to producers or carbon management, these are all additional roles that have been put on geos. These roles are not really recognized within the Renewable Energy Directive, but they are recognized in other legislations. So that's one thing just to be clear here. And the second thing is in regards to the additional revenue stream for producers. That's definitely important, especially when the price of geos shot through the sky. I think it was in 2022, 2023, when we saw some individual trades scratching the roof of 8 to 10 euros per megawatt hour. Definitely we could then say that, yes, geos definitely have a big role to play for renewable energy producers. And increasingly now, when you look at project developers, they do take geos into account for sure because they matter in their revenue stream. Just how much? I don't have the numbers. I think you just have to ask around, and it's good when market players like Landsvirkjun publish their data and share directly what role geos play in their revenue generation.
Have you seen any of this sort of analysis or discussion in this additional legislative documents, or it's too much of a not primary thing, as you mentioned? in the
Not
policy?
that I'm aware of. I would say currently in the European Union, PPAs are carved out a bigger role than geos. If you look at different communications from the Commission, they time and time again mention PPAs, and that secures renewable energy build out while also guaranteeing stable prices to off-takers. And I don't see that same role being put for geos.
That makes sense. What about eco labels? So that's an interesting topic, right? We're basically getting eco labels to all of our producers. Like almost all of them are applicable. There's definitely, especially voluntary market buyers who are interested in that. So has that ever reached like policy level as well, or is that like purely private market incentive?
Yeah, actually, you're spot on. It is in the Commission, and they released one document that has relevance to the geo market, but it has not been yet adopted. So the name is the Green Claims Directive, which aims to prevent greenwashing on the European market. And one thing about the voluntary labels is that they mention that if you want to make this kind of claim, they need to comply with certain ISO standards. And currently only 2 eco-labels comply. I think it's TÜV Rheinland, and I don't remember the second one. I think it was either Nature Made or Swan label. Don't quote me on that. TÜV Rheinland definitely falls and passes.
Well, we're gonna have to follow up on that one. That sounds very interesting.
Yes, definitely. But negotiations have yet to go through, so we don't really know what's going to be the final content of that Green Claims Directive, because both the European Council and the Parliament had diverging views. They converged in one places and not in others. So I don't really know whether that provision that only ISO certified eco-labels would be admissible for making environmental claims will hold. Maybe that provision will be gone. But in any case, all eco-labels under the current design of the Green Claims Directive will have to go through checking and certification by specifically appointed national bodies to make sure that there's no greenwashing. So there will be more administrative processes involved.
But I do think that actually RED plus or the RED free directive indirectly mentioned eco labels, right? Because it talked about how you can't break up geo attributes, right? You can't correct me if I'm wrong, Ollie, but we had quite a lengthy discussion about that with Tal. Yeah, attribute aggregation. Yeah. So it didn't mention eco label by its word, but essentially, it sort of already hinted that it's not only geo, there could be other attributes, but you can't break them up and sell separately. You have to keep them together in a single package, basically, which I think makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, let's be honest, nobody will understand what's going on because there's just too many terms flying around. And you sort of gotta keep it reasonable in people's head to maintain strong trust in the system and everything.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Something I see popping up throughout every single question you've answered is that it's not about reacting to legislation and policy once it's been implemented. It's about predicting it and monitoring the negotiations, monitoring the developments. So, for those who want to stay on top of EU developments and member state developments, do you have any recommendations of tools or dashboards, or what is your process of making sure you don't miss anything? Because there's obviously so much to keep track of. I'm kind of in awe that you managed to stay aware of everything that's going on.
Yeah, thank you. I use a lot of tools, so if you reach out privately, of course, I'll share that. But it's a lot about having good contacts in Brussels, but also across different member states to be aware what's happening, because sometimes certain news don't even reach the market. They're just word of mouth, so to say. So you really need to make sure you have a good network of policymakers.
Obviously, you just gotta use Veyt, then you can get all the policy over with.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, why hire your own policy analyst if you can have access to the platform where you have access to our analysis at a fraction of the cost of a full-time policy analyst? It's expensive.
Are there any key points we want to touch on before we, just as a final segment?
I don't know, maybe are there any topics that keep you awake at night as a founder? Are there any topics that bother you in particular in relation to the geo market?
Absolutely. And I think actually we sort of begun with that topic, to be honest, because like it is very relevant and interesting to us, like how the market price is gonna move. We're also interested in branching. One thing we didn't touch on at all, we only talked about renewable geos, but there's also, biogas coming up and so on. The big thing that really keeps us up at night is that where is the market gonna go, right? If it goes back to like 10 cents, like it was just like 3 or 4 years ago, I think the market will become quite uninteresting for most market participants, to be honest. Or is it gonna move somewhere else? And we've been following, of course, the Veyt market webinars and predictions for a while. We always love your insights and what you discuss over there as well. It did actually, one time it did make me consider, like, who are, by the way, like, if you're allowed to say, like, Veyt's biggest customer base? Is it mostly on consumer side, or is it producer or traders and brokers and so on? Like,
it's all of these market players that you have just mentioned.
So basically, it's everybody.
Pretty much, yes. Yeah, definitely.
I think I'm curious. When I was scoping out, obviously I've joined Soldera now, so part of me was thinking, well, what would be the existential policy risk for a company like Soldera and anybody who's attempting to do sort of aggregation in this space. And I think I'd be concerned that, obviously Stenva mentioned earlier, a lot of the barriers to entry for smaller producers, that the way that the EU or the Commission resolved that is by implementing some sort of aggregation at the very set core level to the geo market, and allowing producers themselves to sort of bundle and group together their assets. So do you think that's something that could possibly happen or not?
Thing is, you never know. But I'm just saying that the legislative uncertainty that the Commission is creating is not very good for the market, for any businesses, really. So I think that would be the most fair assessment, that the Commission is the problem itself. Like, sure, they try to do more with less, but at the same time, it creates ripple effects in the market and creates this legislative uncertainty and the environment where it's really hard to make decisions.
And I think it's the kind of like the double-edged sword of building a government technology company in any sense. Is like, so much of your work is streamlined by the existing kind of structures that are there, whether that's like distribution, finding the people you're serving, really isolating the problem. But at the same time, that legislative uncertainty means that it's the difference between day and night, depending on what happens.
Definitely. These are such are the times that we live in. I think it's especially important to us at Veyt to follow these developments closely, because we constantly need to revise our market assumptions. So we do geo market forecasting, so medium, short term and long term. And now with the Omnibus package, we really need to sit down and think hard, okay, what's going to be our market assessment? Because I don't think the outlook that we had before may necessarily hold in the future, because everything is changing so rapidly.
We touched a lot on topics that actually do keep us up at night, and really appreciate all your comments and everything. This has been super educational to me, Mary. Anything else you want to touch before we wrap this up?
I think we're good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. I'll also mention that Mary posts like the most phenomenal content on LinkedIn as well. So if you guys are interested in like following the geo market in a really digestible sense, and there's always something new as well. It's really great. You're so consistent with it. So definitely shout out there. Other than that, I think that was a really great episode. Again, I learned a lot. I'm gonna have to probably re-listen to this one to make sure I caught everything. But yeah, thank you, Mary, and catch us in the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.